When examination time crept near and the colleges grew feverish with figures and speculation, Malcolm Malcolmson did a thing unfashionable. He fled from both applause and distraction. He distrusted the bright temptations of the seaside, and he feared, with equal wisdom, the soft, dissolving idleness of deep country quiet, whose charms he already knew too well. He desired not pleasure, but an astringent solitude, bare of acquaintance and of all those kindly hands that draw a man away from his own stern purpose. So he resolved to lose himself in some small, unremarkable town whose very dullness would stand sentinel over his books. Without counsel from friend or tutor, for he had no wish to be followed, even by the ghosts of other people's recollections, he packed a single portmanteau with plain clothes and the volumes that were to be his only company. Then, standing before the timetable like a penitent before an altar, he chose the first name among the stations that meant nothing to him and took a ticket for that unfamiliar word. After 3 hours' journey through a land that grew more featureless as the train devoured it, he alighted at Benchurch. The very sound of the place was uninspired. The reality satisfied him even more. Here, surely, he had stepped sufficiently aside from his own traces. Here no friendly coincidence would call his name in the street. The town had but one inn, a low, drowsy house whose sign proclaimed it the Good Traveler, as though it blessed the rare soul who passed through and did not stay. Malcolmson took a room there for the night and slept under its sagging roof with the curious comfort of a man who has successfully effaced himself. Benchurch was a market town in name, a deserted shrine the rest of the time. Once in 3 weeks it swelled into noisy life, its narrow ways clogged with carts and cattle and the bargaining of men. But for the other 21 days it sank back into something like suspension, as though the place itself were holding its breath. It was on one of those long-held breaths that Malcolmson, the day after his arrival, went out to hunt solitude more absolute than even the inn could offer. There was, as if the town had been ashamed to admit it, only one dwelling that answered the darker half of his wish. To call it merely quiet would have been to flatter it with too gentle a word. It stood not in quiet, but in abandonment. It was a large, brooding house of the Jacobean time, with heavy, overhanging gables and windows set small and high, as though the builder mistrusted the day. A brick wall, tall and massively laid, enclosed it on every side, a wall more suggestive of siege than of garden. The place had the air not of having grown old among neighbors, but of having retreated from them. To Malcolmson, whose mind had been tuned for weeks to problems and proofs, the sight of it was like the QED at the end of a long theorem, inevitable and satisfying. Here, he thought, pausing before the iron gate, is the very cell I have been seeking. If I can but gain entrance, my work will have the cloister it deserves. His satisfaction deepened when, after a little discreet inquiry, he learned that the house was uninhabited and had been so for many years. The post office, which in such towns is an oracle as well as a convenience, gave him the name of the agent. The man, a local solicitor called Carnford, received his application with a surprise that quickly warmed into pleasure. It appeared that no one in Benchurch had desired, in living memory, to pass a night beneath that roof. "To tell you the truth," said Mr. Carnford, rubbing his thin hands with candor, "on behalf of the owners, I should be glad to let the place rent-free for a term, if only to accustom the people here to see it inhabited again. The house has stood so long empty that a kind of prejudice has grown up about it. A foolish thing, but there it is. The best remedy is to have some steady occupant, if only," he added, his eyes glinting with a little professional humor, "some scholar who cares more for equations than for old wives' tales." Malcolmson did not trouble the lawyer with questions about the prejudice. Gossip, he knew, was best drunk at the tap, not in the counting-house. If there was any substance to the town's unease, he would hear it soon enough in the parlor of the inn, filtered through Mrs. Whittam's kindly tongue. For the present, it was enough that the house was his. He paid 3 months' rent in advance, took the keys, and accepted from Carnford the name of an old woman who might do for him in the rough way such houses required. Stepping back into the pale daylight with the iron chill of the keys in his pocket, he felt the curious exhilaration of a man about to enter not merely a dwelling, but a chosen isolation. His next visit was to the landlady of The Good Traveller. Mrs. Whittam was a cheerful creature, full of domestic certainties and bustling charity. When he spread out his list of provisions and stores, she listened with the grave attention of a general planning supplies for a siege. But when he told her calmly where he intended to lodge, the color drained from her round face as though some invisible tide had gone out. "Not there, sir," she said, and the bright room seemed to darken with her words. "Not in the judge's house." He looked at her in genuine surprise, under the impression that he had mentioned only the situation of the place. "I did not know it had a name," he answered. "I described it as best I could." "Aye, and no mistake," she murmured. "The tall brick wall, the old gables, the long windows like little slits. Sure enough, that's the judge's house." She crossed herself with an unconscious gesture, then apologized with a flustered curtsy. "They call it so here, sir, because long ago, more than my years can tell you, there lived in it a judge from the assizes, a harsh man by all accounts, one that took pleasure in the passing of sentence, and had never a soft corner for a prisoner. There's not an old woman in the parish but can tell you how his name was spoken with dread." "And the house?" asked Malcolmson, with the faint smile of one who humors a legend. "What is there against it?" "That," she confessed, spreading her hands, "no one seems rightly to know. There is a feeling only, a something not to be named. I have asked and asked, Lord knows I have, and never got more than a shake of the head. But I tell you this, sir, there is not money enough in Drinkwater's bank to make me pass 1 hour alone in it after dark." Then, ashamed of having startled a guest who had shown her nothing but civility, she hastened to soften her words. "It is too bad of me, sir, to speak so, and you a young gentleman with a head full of learning. You'll be thinking me a foolish old woman, and mayhap I am. Only, if you were my own son, I would sooner drag you out by the hand than let you sleep there a night. And if I couldn't drag you," she added in a sudden burst of terror, "I would go myself and pull at the big alarm bell on the roof till the whole town came running." Her sincerity was so naked that it touched him. Amused as he was by her fears, he could not laugh unkindly at this stout little figure who would fling herself into a haunted house for the sake of a lad she had known only a day. "My dear Mrs. Whittam," he said, with a grave courtesy that sat well on his youthful face, "believe that I am grateful for your concern, but I assure you, there is nothing in that old house which can trouble a man whose head is full of the mathematical tripos. Harmonical progressions and elliptic functions are bogies enough for me. There is no spare corner in my mind for others." She allowed herself to be half convinced for his sake, if not for her own, and when he asked her aid in procuring what he needed, she threw herself into the business with renewed zeal. While he went to seek the old woman recommended by the agent, she gathered men and boys, hampers of food, and even an upholsterer's man with a decent bed, for, as she declared, no young bones should rest upon a mattress that had lain for half a century in untroubled dust. By the time Malcolmson returned with Mrs. Dempster, the charwoman selected by fate and greenhouse charity, he found Mrs. Witham herself at the gate of the judge's house, directing the little procession like a general at the storming of a gloomy fortress. For all her practical briskness, she clung, once within, closer than a shadow to his arm, and whenever some chance sound echoed in the empty corridors, her fingers tightened on his sleeve. They went through the house from garret to kitchen. The air in it had that peculiar stillness which belongs not to simple vacancy, but to a long, watchful pause. Dust lay everywhere in a fine, unbroken veil. Doors moved a little stiffly on their hinges, as though they resented being wakened. And now and then a far, faint creak came from the paneling, like the memory of footsteps. After a thorough survey, Malcolmson chose the great dining room for his abode. It was a long, high chamber with dark oak wainscoting, a vast stone fireplace, and at the far end tall windows where the light came in sparely as through the slit of a visor. A single room would thus serve him for study, living, and sleep, and he liked the severity of the arrangement. Mrs. Witham, with Mrs. Dempster's sharper hands to aid her, saw to the making of a little island of comfort in that sea of neglect. When the hampers were unpacked, Malcolmson discovered, with a surprise not unmixed with gratitude, that her generosity had overflowed his list. Her own kitchen had been quietly raided that he might not lack a decent supper for several days. At parting, she hesitated on the threshold, the long room stretching behind her like a darkened nave. "Perhaps, sir," she ventured, eyeing the tall, draughty space, "as the room is so big and the nights so chill, you would do well to have a screen set round your bed. It keeps off many a cold. Though for myself—" She broke off suddenly, her imagination running ahead of her words. "For myself, I could not lie so shut in, with the dark on every side and things putting their heads round the edges to look in at you." The picture she had raised was too much for her own nerves. With a little cry of apology, she fled, leaving behind her the faint scent of kitchen spices and fear. Mrs. Dempster watched her departure with a sniff which implied that courage, like honesty, was largely a matter of class. "For my own part, sir," she said, folding her bony arms, "I'm not afraid of all the bogies in the kingdom. Bogies is all sorts of things except bogies, rats and mice and beetles, creaky doors and loose slates and broken panes, and them drawers that stick fast when you pull 'em and then come down in the middle of the night. Look at that wainscot, old as sin, so it is. Do you suppose there's no rats nor beetles in it? You'll see 'em, never fear. Rats is bogies, and bogies is rats, and don't you let no one tell you different." "Mrs. Dempster," said Malcolmson, bowing with solemn gravity, "your philosophy does honor to both head and heart. When my time is up, I shall mark my esteem by leaving you in possession of this house for the remainder of my term. 2 months of such solitude as this might make a saint of any woman." "Thank you kindly, sir," she answered, with a harsh little laugh. "But I couldn't sleep from home a night. I'm in greenhouse charity, and if I'm away from my room after dark, I lose my bit of living. The rules is strict, and there's too many waiting for a vacancy. Only for that, I'd stop here and attend to you altogether." "My good woman," said Malcolmson, almost hastily, "I came here expressly to be alone. Allow me, then, to express my gratitude to the late Greenhow for protecting me, by his admirable regulations, from temptation to the contrary. St. Anthony himself could not have been more careful." She chuckled dryly and went about her cleaning, and by the time he returned from the long walk he always took with a book in his hand, the great room had been swept and dusted, a fire kindled on the old hearth, the lamp lit, and the table set with a modest but sufficient supper from Mrs. Witham's bounty. "This," he said, rubbing his hands as he looked about him, "is solitude made comfortable." When he had eaten and set the tray aside, he replenished the fire, trimmed the lamp, and spread his books on the broad oak table. Outside, the evening thickened over the town. Inside, the circle of lamplight was a clear island in a sea of shadow. He fell to work with the appetite of a man who has at last secured for himself the very conditions he has been craving. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Only when the clock somewhere in the town struck 11 did he pause, stretch, and decide that he had earned a little refreshment. He coaxed the fire into a brighter blaze, set water to boil, and made himself a cup of tea. He had long been a late worker and a late tea drinker. The ritual soothed him as much by association as by warmth. With the hot cup in his hand and the glow of the coals leaping and sinking in the great hearth, he abandoned himself for a few moments to a delicious sense of isolation. The world of men, with its disputations and demands, lay very far away. It was then, in the interval between problem and problem, that he first became conscious of another presence in the house. At first it was only a sound, so woven into the old building's natural creaks and sighs that he could not be sure when it began. A faint stir, a patter, a scratching not unlike the soft rasp of a pen on paper. Presently, it grew in volume and complexity, resolving itself into a wild, invisible gymnastic among the panels and under the floor. Surely, he thought, setting down his cup to listen, they cannot have been at this all the time I was working. I should have noticed. As he hearkened, the noise grew bolder, as though whatever skulked in the wainscot had at first been cowed by the light and by the presence of a stranger, but had now regained its customary liberty. Up and down behind the paneling they raced and gnawed and chattered. Overhead, along the beams, he heard their tiny claws. Under the flooring, they scampered in blind, confident profusion. He smiled, remembering Mrs. Dempster's dogma. Bogies is rats, and rats is bogies, he murmured. If all ghosts were of that species, greenhouse charity would never lack applicants. The tea began to work its subtle change in him, sharpening his faculties and lending his mind that elastic brightness which students come to crave like a drug. Feeling another long spell of clear-headed labor before him, he allowed himself the indulgence of a survey. Taking the lamp in one hand, he went slowly round the room. The great wainscoted walls were a marvel of old carving, grim and intricate. Around doors and windows, the oak was cut into strange, foliated forms, with here and there grotesque faces peering from the knots and corners. A series of pictures hung above the paneling, a gloomy company under their gray fur of dust, yet they were so obscured that, though he raised the lamp as high as his arm would allow, he could distinguish nothing clearly. From time to time, as he moved, a pair of bright points would flash for an instant from some crack, and then vanish with a squeak and a scurry. One thing, however, arrested him more than the rest. In the corner to the right of the fireplace hung a thick rope, descending from a small circle in the ceiling and ending in a tassel-like coil just above the floor. It was the rope of the great alarm bell that crowned the house. The sight of it thrilled him with a curious mixture of reassurance and unease. It was a direct throat for the house to cry through if ever silence became too oppressive. He drew a great high-backed carved oak chair near the fire and sat for a while finishing his tea. When the cup was empty, he made up the fire once more, set the lamp back upon the table with its green shade adjusted so that the light fell on his books, and left the upper part of the room in shadow, and plunged again into his work. The patter and scamper of the rats came and went about him, but he grew inured to it, as one grows inured to the ticking of a clock or the rumor of distant water, until at last numbers and symbols filled his whole horizon. He did not know how long he had sat so, when a change in the atmosphere, rather than a sound, drew him abruptly back to himself. The scribbling of little claws had ceased, not faded, but stopped, as if at a signal. A profound stillness had fallen upon the house. The fire, though low, still burned with a deep red heart, sending out a sullen glow. The lamp cast its steady pool of light upon the table. He lifted his head. There, In the great high-backed chair by the right-hand side of the hearth sat an enormous rat. It sat erect, its forepaws gathered against its breast, its long body looming larger in that uncertain light than any beast of such kind had right to loom. Its eyes, cold, bright, and singularly intent, were fixed upon him with what he could not but interpret as a deliberate malice. Without thinking, he made a slight motion with his hand, as one does to drive off an ordinary intruder. The rat did not stir. He made the gesture more sharply, miming the act of throwing something. Still it remained, and now its lips drew back a little, showing the harsh white of its teeth, while its eyes took on a more vindictive glitter. Amazement pricked him, then irritation. Seizing the poker from the hearth, he rose and advanced upon the creature with the plain intention of killing it. The rat, however, sprang before the blow could fall, uttering a squeak that seemed to embody in one thin note an accumulation of hatred. Instead of retreating along the floor, it ran, with horrible quickness and assurance, straight up the rope of the alarm bell and vanished into the darkness beyond the lamplight's green circle. Instantly, as though some spell had been broken, the noisy revel of the lesser rats burst out again in the wainscot. By then, Malcolmson's mind was far from his problem. The thin cry of the big rat and the strange, purposeful way in which it had taken to the rope had jarred even his stubborn rationalism. He sat listening to the renewed scampering until a shrill cock-crow from some unseen yard outside announced the drawing on of dawn. Then, more tired in spirit than in body, he undressed behind the screen Mrs. Whittam had insisted upon and went to bed. Sleep came heavily and held him so fast that he did not hear Mrs. Dempster's entrance in the morning. It was only when she had set the room to rights, laid his breakfast, and at last tapped discreetly on the screen that he woke, bewildered for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings. A strong cup of tea, this one sanctioned by no doctor, soon restored him, and taking his book under his arm and a few sandwiches in his pocket, he went out to walk, and to study beneath a line of high elms beyond the town. The day passed in Laplace and quiet air. By the time he turned back towards Benchurch, his mind had recovered much of its ordinary tone, and the events of the night before seemed less uncanny in the dry glare of reason. On his way he stopped, as courtesy demanded and inclination allowed, at the Good Traveller. Mrs. Whittam, catching sight of him through the small diamond panes of her parlor window, came out herself to meet him and drew him inside with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "You must not overdo it, sir," she said, looking him over with an anxious eye. "You are paler this morning than is right for a young gentleman. Late hours and hard work is bad company for the brain. Tell me now, how did you pass the night?" "Excellently," he replied, smiling. "Your somethings left me alone. Only the rats kept holiday. They made such a riot in the walls that, if rats are indeed bogies, you may boast the most haunted house in the county. There was one in particular, a villainous-looking brute, that sat in my own chair by the fire and would not stir till I went at him with the poker. Then he ran up the rope of the alarm bell and got away in the dark." "Mercy preserve us," cried Mrs. Whittam, clasping her hands. "An old devil sitting in a chair by the fireside. Take care, sir, take care. There's many a true word spoken in jest." "How do you mean?" he asked, still amused. "Upon my word, I don't take your meaning." "An old devil," she repeated, her voice dropping. "The old devil, maybe. There now, you needn't laugh." For Malcolmson's hearty laughter had broken out, though he tried to check it for her sake. "You young folks think it fine to mock at what makes your elders shudder. The Lord grant you may always have the heart to laugh." "Forgive me," he said presently. "I would not hurt your feelings for the world. Only the picture was too much for me, that the devil himself should take my chair by the fire." He laughed again, but more gently, and soon after took his leave to dine at the judge's house. That evening the rats announced their presence earlier. Indeed, the noise of them was in full course when he entered, and only sank to a more cautious level while he moved about the room. After dinner he smoked a cigarette by the hearth, watching their bold ventures along the moldings and at the mouths of their holes, until the time came when conscience called him back to his books. Then he cleared the table, set the lamp as before, and sat down to work. Tonight the tumult of the rats troubled him more. They grew audacious, venturing far from their chinks, racing along the floor in little gray torrents, and peering out with eyes that caught the firelight like a scatter of dull beads. Yet, as he watched them with half a smile, their antics struck him less as sinister than as grotesquely companionable. There is a point in solitude at which even vermin begin to seem like company. From time to time their noise vexed him, and he would strike the table suddenly with his hand or hiss them away. At such moments they fled in all directions, only to return again in a few minutes with their courage renewed. So the early hours wore by, the equations on his paper accumulating like the gray scores of the rats upon the walls. And then, as on the previous night, the house drew breath and held it. The scratching and squeaking ceased so completely that the silence itself became a sound. With that same instinct that had startled him before, he turned his eyes to the great chair by the fire. There sat the rat. It was the same enormous beast, or so he believed. The same sleek, dark body, the same malignant stillness, the same small, intent eyes fixed unblinking on his face. Without thinking, he snatched up the nearest object to hand, a heavy book of logarithms, and flung it. The missile flew wide, striking the paneling with a hollow thud. The rat did not so much as twitch. Anger pricked him. Taking again the poker, he strode towards the chair as he had done before. Once more the creature waited until he was within striking distance, and then, with the same thin squeal of concentrated hate, darted to the floor and ran up the rope of the alarm bell. The lesser rats, as though released from enchantment, at once resumed their gambols. The repetition of the incident, its exactness down to the moment of renewed scampering in the walls, fretted more on his nerves than he cared to confess. When at last he pushed his books aside and looked at his watch, he found it was near midnight. Remembering his promise to the doctor, whom as yet he had not met, but whose admonitions were already being prepared for him, he resolved to break off with some pomp of refreshment. He made up the fire, brewed his nightly pot of tea, and lighted a cigarette, then drew the great oak chair close and sat in it himself, facing the room. As he smoked, it occurred to him that he would like to know whither the great rat went when it left the rope. With the coolness of a mind trained to follow up a hint, he began to lay a little snare of observation. He lit another lamp and set it so that its light fell full upon the corner where the rope hung. All the books he had with him he stacked within arm's reach for missiles. Finally, he lifted the rope and drew its end upon the table, fastening it under the base of the lamp so that any movement upon it must stir the light. As he handled the cord, he could not help remarking the suppleness of it, remarkable in a rope so stout and so little used. A thought, uninvited and unwelcome, slipped across his mind. "You could hang a man well enough with this," he said half aloud, and then laughed at himself for giving words to the fancy. When his arrangements were made, he regarded them with quiet satisfaction. "There, my friend," he murmured to the unseen rat, "we shall perhaps learn something of your habits tonight." He went back to his seat and resumed his work, the riot of the rats around him at first a distraction, and then a mere texture of sound beneath his thoughts. When the summons came, it was more definite than before. The sudden silence was accompanied by a slight jar of the lamp. Without moving at once, he let his eyes travel along the rope. Halfway down it, clinging with an air of hateful ease, was the rat. Deliberately, he took up one of the books, weighed it in his hand, and flung it. The rat sprang aside, and the book struck the wall. A second, a third followed, with no better success. At last, as he poised another volume, he saw the beast shrink a little and give a faint, involuntary cry. The sight stirred in him a kind of hunter's eagerness. He launched the book with all his force. It struck the rat full. There was a sharp squeak of terror and fury, and the creature, turning its head, shot at him a look of indescribable malevolence. Then, with a leap more like the spring of some larger animal than of a common rat, it gained the back of the oak chair, and from thence the rope, up which it ran with lightning speed. The lamp rocked under the jerk, but did not fall. This time he kept his eyes fixed on the rat's course. By the added light of the second lamp, he saw it run along the molding of the wainscot and disappear into a small hole in the corner of one of the pictures, the third from the fireplace. "I shall visit your lodgings in the morning," he said, going to gather his scattered books. "The third picture from the hearth, I shall remember." As he picked up the volumes, his eye fell upon the one that had finally struck the rat. He took it up, half smiling, and then the smile faded. It was the Bible his mother had given him when he first went up to college. A sudden chill went through him. The coincidence was absurd, trivial, yet for a moment it shook him. He stood with the book in his hand, looking round the shadowy room, and felt an unaccustomed shiver run along his nerves. "Oh, doctor, what do you mean?" "I mean," he said, with a certain grimness, "that it is more than possible we shall hear the great alarm bell of the judge's house before the night is over." He left her with that, making an exit worthy of the stage. When Malcolmson returned to the judge's house, he found the room bright and orderly, a good fire on the hearth and the lamp set ready. Mrs. Dempster had gone, Greenhouse charity allowing no leniency for late service. Outside, the wind that had been only a murmur in the elms had risen to a determined voice. It beat about the old house with increasing violence, and there was in its tone a promise of storm. For a few minutes after he entered, the rats were silent. Then, as though reassured, they began again their ceaseless ranging behind the wainscot. Their noise pleased him. After the talk at the inn, their homely racket seemed to stand between him and the suggestion of more intangible company. He lit only the reading lamp, whose green shade left the ceiling and upper walls in shadow, while it made a warm lake of light upon the floor and white tablecloth. He ate with good appetite, smoked his quiet cigarette, and then, reminded of his pledge to the doctor, set himself resolutely to work, determined to make the best of the hours to midnight. But the storm outside grew, and with it the old house began to speak in unfamiliar tongues. The wind found its way into unused chimneys and queer gables, making a great roar in some passages and a long, wavering moan in others. Doors far off answered with ghostly rattlings. The very bell on the roof seemed at times to feel the storm's hand, so that the rope rose and fell a little, dropping now and then with a dull, hollow sound upon the oaken floor. As he listened, half against his will, the doctor's words returned to him. "It is the rope which the hangman used." He rose and went to it. There was, he admitted to himself, a morbid fascination in the thought of the grim uses to which those twisted strands had once been put. He found himself wondering who the men were whose last sight of the world had been the face of that very judge whose house he now profaned with lamps and cigarettes, and whether the judge had chosen to keep the rope near him as a kind of memento or trophy. The bell swung in the gale, the rope stirred in his hand. Then, suddenly, he felt another motion, small, deliberate, and different from the crude pull of the storm. Looking up, he saw the great rat coming slowly down towards him, its eyes burning with the same fixed, baleful light. He dropped the rope with an oath and started back. The rat, turning, ran up again and vanished into the darkness above, and almost at once the chorus of the lesser rats broke out once more.
The incident, coming on the tail of the doctor's story, set him thinking in a less comfortable fashion than before. It occurred to him that he had not yet examined the lair to which the beast retired. He lit the second lamp and, holding it high, went to stand before the third picture from the fireplace. At the first clear sight of it, his heart seemed to stand still. The canvas, newly freed from its shroud of grime by Mrs. Dempster's vigorous hand, showed a full-length portrait of a judge in scarlet and ermine. The face was strong, heavy, and cruel, the mouth full-lipped and sensual, the nose hooked and ruddy like the beak of some great bird of prey. But it was the eyes that froze him. They were bright with a terrible, malignant intelligence, and as he looked into them, he recognized them. They were the eyes of the rat. For a second the room swung before him. He clutched the lamp lest it fall and shatter. Then, as he steadied himself, he became aware that in the corner of the picture there was a small, fresh-edged hole, the very vent by which he had seen the rat escape. He turned, trembling, to look towards the hearth. There, in the judge's own great chair, with the rope of the alarm bell hanging like a pall behind, sat the rat, its eyes now more intensely charged with that same vindictive fire. Save for the rage of the storm without, the house was utterly still. The practical need of guarding the lamp dragged him back from the edge of panic. He turned off the second light, set it safe, and stood for a moment wiping the cold sweat from his brow. "This will not do," he said again between his teeth. "If I go on in this way, I shall indeed end in Bedlam. It is only that my nerves are shaken with too much tea and too little sleep." Deliberately he mixed himself a stiff glass of brandy and water and drank it down. Then he returned to his books with an effort of will that would have done credit to a better cause than the proving of any theorem.
Time slipped on. The storm increased until the old house seemed to rock in its wrath. The fire had sunk low and gave out only a steady red glow. Within, all was quiet, save for the deep, organ-like note of the wind in the great chimney, and now and then the thin hiss of rain forced down it. Then, very faintly at first, he heard a small, recurring sound from the corner where the rope lay upon the floor, a thin, feeble creaking. At first, he thought it no more than the rope rubbing on the boards as the bell swayed, but when he looked up, he saw in the dull light the outline of the great rat clinging to the rope and gnawing steadily. The strands were already partly severed. He could see where the pale inner fibers showed through. As he watched, fascinated, the work was completed, and the end of the rope fell clattering on the floor. For an instant, the rat hung like a black tassel from the swaying line above, then dropped softly to the boards and darted away into the shadow. A sharp pang went through him as he realized that his one means of summoning help from the sleeping town had been cut away. But anger was stronger than fear. Snatching up the heavy book he had been reading, he hurled it at the vanishing creature. It missed, of course, and he saw nothing but the ripple of shadow as it fled. His work for the night was, he knew, at an end. With something like grim humor, he decided to vary the program with a rat hunt. Removing the green shade from the lamp, he let a fuller light flood the upper reaches of the room. In that clearer radiance, the pictures stood out sharply. He looked instinctively towards the third picture. Where the judge had sat in scarlet and ermine, there was now only a great irregular patch of bare, brown canvas, the paint stripped clean away as if torn by invisible claws. The background remained, the stone chimney corner, the high-backed chair, the hanging rope coiled on the floor, but the figure had vanished. A deadly chill ran through him. He turned slowly. The judge sat in his own chair. He sat erect, his robes about him, his eyes fixed upon the student with a gaze of triumphant cruelty. In his hands he held a black cap, which he lifted slowly as the storm roared and the wind drove the rain in sheets against the old windows. Malcolmson felt his heart laboring in his breast and a singing in his ears. The great clock in the marketplace began to strike, its strokes swept to him on the gale. As each note fell, the smile upon the judge's lips deepened, and at the last stroke of midnight he set the cap upon his head. Then, with a dreadful leisure, he rose, stooped, and picked up from the floor the end of the rope the rat had gnawed through. Drawing it slowly through his hands, as though caressing it, he began to tie a knot, deliberately, skillfully, like a man returning to an old and practiced task. When it was fashioned, he tightened and tested it with his foot. Satisfied, he made of it a running noose and held it ready. Moving along the far side of the table, never taking his eyes from Malcolmson, he came round until he stood between the student and the door. Malcolmson knew then that he was trapped. There was in those eyes a fascination no will could resist. He saw the judge raise the noose and cast it with a motion horribly familiar. With a convulsive effort, he sprang aside and heard the rope fall with a thud where he had stood. Again and again the noose swung towards him. Again and again he evaded it by the barest margin. The judge never hurried, never lost his air of cold, malicious enjoyment. It was the play of a cat with a mouse, prolonged for the pleasure of the tormentor. Despair, rising to its last pitch, broke something in the young man's restraint. He cast a wild glance round the room, seeking any ally. The lamp had flared up, and by its added light he saw, in every rat-hole and crack and cranny of the wainscot, eyes, hundreds of small, watching eyes. This purely physical sight, this multitude of common vermin, gave him, by some strange inversion, a thread of comfort. He looked up. The rope of the great alarm bell was alive with rats. Every inch of it was covered with them. More were pouring in a continuous stream through the circular hole in the ceiling. Their combined weight had set the great bell in motion. It swayed. The clapper struck the side with a small, tentative note. Again it swayed. The stroke was louder. The sound of it mingled with the thunder and the wind. At that first thin toll, the judge's head jerked up. A fury, diabolical and naked, leaped into his face. His eyes flamed. He stamped so that the solid floor seemed to shake. Another crash of thunder rolled above the house as he raised the rope once more, the noose widening like a pale, hateful halo in his hands, while the rats scurried up and down the bell rope as though they, too, strove for something beyond their kind. This time he did not cast the thing from afar. Instead, he advanced, slowly, deliberately, bearing the open noose before him like a sacrament of death. With each step, the air itself seemed to congeal, thick with an unseen pressure, until Malcolmson stood fixed and lifeless, as though the grave had already claimed him. No tremor stirred his limbs. No breath broke his lips. Then came the touch. The judge's fingers, cold as winter iron, brushed the young man's throat, arranging the rope with a dreadful intimacy. The cord drew close, closer, tightening with a patient, inexorable will as though it obeyed not the hand, but some older decree. Without haste, the judge gathered the rigid body into his grasp and bore it across the chamber. He set the student upright upon the oaken chair, a grotesque elevation, and mounted beside him with grave composure. Reaching upward, he seized the swaying rope of the alarm bell. At that motion, the rats, those loathsome witnesses, broke into frantic retreat, their shrill cries scattering into the hollow dark above, vanishing through the ceiling's black aperture as though fleeing judgment. The judge took the slack of the noose and bound it fast to the bell rope. Then, with a final, measured descent, he withdrew the chair. Silence held for but a breath,
And then the bell began to toll. Its iron voice shattered the night. From every quarter they came, lights flaring, torches guttering in the wind, feet hastening over stone and earth. A gathering formed, urgent, murmuring, yet curiously subdued, as though some instinct warned them they approached not merely death, but something fouler. They beat upon the door. No answer came. With force they broke it inward and surged into the great dining hall, the doctor pressing foremost among them. There, beneath the swinging line of the great alarm bell, hung the student, lifeless, suspended in dreadful stillness. And high above, within the frame that watched it all, the judge's painted face bore a smile, thin, knowing, and unspeakably malignant.